I'm Corey Prophet Boyd, and this is Say It Anyway.
Say it anyway with Corey Prophet Boyd. Say it anyway. Say it anyway with Corey Prophet Boyd. Say it anyway.
Hi, friend. We've made it through another week, and I'm so glad you're able to spend some time with me today. I always look really forward to it. You know, just a couple of days ago, someone started talking to me about how their feelings were hurt by one of their parents and how they just couldn't understand how their parents could hurt their feelings like that. And I wanted to just be there for this person and just hold space and listen and validate their feelings. And after that, I did not just start into my own story, but I did ask if they'd like me to share my own story that was relatable, and they said yes, and it really seemed to shift something in both of us, and so I'd like to share it with you too. There was a season of my life when I honestly believed my dad was trying to hurt my feelings. Looking back now, I don't think that's what he was trying to do at all, but when you're living in the middle of something, it's hard to see beyond your own hurt. I spent years wondering why someone who was supposed to love me could say things that cut so deeply. And I kept hoping that one day he would become the father I wanted him to be, without ever stopping to ask myself what had made him the man he had become. That's a question I wasn't ready to ask back then because, if I'm being honest, I was hurting too much. When you're carrying that kind of hurt, your mind naturally looks for someone to blame because blame feels much easier than trying to understand something that just doesn't make any sense to you. It gives you somewhere to place the pain, and for a while that almost feels comforting because at least you think you've figured out why your heart feels the way it does. The problem is that life usually isn't that simple, and neither are people. As the years went by, I became more interested in personal growth, spirituality, and trying to understand why people behave the way they do. I wasn't searching for excuses for anyone. I was searching for peace because carrying around hurt is so exhausting. And eventually I realized I didn't want to spend the rest of my life waiting for somebody else to become the reason that I could finally feel whole. And somewhere along that journey, something shifted inside me. I began to see my dad differently. Not as the man who had hurt my feelings so many times, but as a man who was loving me with the only tools he had ever been given. I honestly don't think he had ever experienced unconditional love himself, and if you've never known what something feels like, it's awfully difficult to give it away to someone else. That realization didn't erase the hurt that I'd carried for so many years, but it certainly changed the way I looked at the person standing on the other side of it. Instead of asking why he couldn't love me the way I needed, I found myself wondering whether anyone had ever loved him the way he needed. And that question changed everything. It didn't happen overnight, and it certainly didn't happen because we suddenly started agreeing about everything. It happened because I stopped looking at the surface of his behavior and became curious about what might be underneath it. I started realizing that many of the traits that had hurt me weren't necessarily who he really was. They were often the result of what had been modeled for him, what had been normalized around him, and the way he had learned to survive long before I ever came into his life. The more I understood that, the more I found myself wanting something different for both of us. I wanted us to have a relationship that wasn't built on old patterns or hurts. I wanted us to know each other without all the walls that had quietly grown between us over the years. And I knew that if anything was ever going to change, somebody had to be willing to take the first step. I wrestled with that for a long time because there were plenty of days when I would ask myself why I should have to be the one who kept trying. I was angry some days, and other days I was just tired. There were moments when it felt unfair because I could list every reason I had to protect myself and walk away. Then one day I did something I had never done before. I stood in front of the mirror and asked myself the same question. Why should I be the one who keeps trying? It sounds like such a simple question, but something about looking into my own eyes instead of just letting the question bounce around inside my head made it impossible to hide from the answer. I could see that beneath all the hurt and disappointment, I still wanted a relationship with my dad. Not because I thought it would magically erase the past, or because I believed everything would suddenly become easy, but because I realized I wanted to know that I had loved him as completely as I possibly could while I still had the chance. And without even realizing it, my question had changed. It wasn't, why should I keep trying? It had quietly become, why shouldn't I? Of course, that doesn't mean everyone should make the same decision I made, because every relationship is different, and there are situations where loving someone from a distance is the healthiest and safest choice. Boundaries matter, and I would never want you to hear my story as a prescription for yours. This is simply what happened inside my own heart when I finally became honest with myself. Several years later, my dad became very sick with liver disease, and it eventually became clear that he wasn't going to recover from it. I remember seeing something in him that I had never seen before. There was a vulnerability that hadn't been there when he was healthy, and for the first time, I sensed that the walls he had spent a lifetime building were beginning to come down slowly. I made him a promise that I would travel that journey with him, and looking back now, I think that promise really changed both of us. I don't know if he would have described it this way, but I believe he finally experienced what unconditional love felt like. I wasn't asking him to earn it, and I wasn't asking him to become somebody different before I would give it to him. I simply wanted to walk beside him, and in doing that, I discovered something I never expected. The relationship I had wanted for so many years finally arrived during the season when we both knew time was running out. And coming up next, I want to tell you about the lesson I never saw coming, because it wasn't really about my dad at all. It was about what was happening inside my own heart, and I have a feeling you may see a little of your own story in it too. You know, if you had asked me 20 years ago what this story was about, I probably would have told you it was about my dad hurting my feelings. If you ask me today, I don't think that's the story anymore. That was certainly part of it, but I don't think it was the part that changed my life. The part that changed my life happened the day I realized I had been asking one question over and over again without ever considering there might be another question hiding underneath it. For years, I kept asking myself why he couldn't love me the way I needed him to. That seemed like the obvious question because, from where I was standing, I was the one who had been hurt. I wanted him to understand me and see me. I wanted him to know how deeply his words and actions had affected me. Those are natural things to want, and I don't think there's anything wrong with admitting that. What surprised me was discovering that I had become so focused on what I needed from him that I had never stopped to wonder what he might have needed from me. And please don't misunderstand what I'm saying, because I know every relationship is different, and I know there are people listening whose safest choice is distance. There are relationships where boundaries are not only healthy but absolutely necessary. And nothing I'm sharing today is meant to suggest you should ignore that. I'm simply telling you what happened inside my own heart, because for me, The breakthrough came when I became curious instead of certain. I started asking myself questions that were uncomfortable because they challenged the story I'd been telling myself for years. What if he really did love me the best way he knew how? What if the things that hurt me the most were the very things someone else had taught him were normal? What if he had spent his whole life surviving instead of learning how to connect? Those questions didn't excuse the hurt, but they did something I never expected. They made room for compassion to sit beside it. I don't think compassion and accountability are enemies. I think they can totally exist together. I can be honest about what hurt me while also recognizing that hurt has a way of traveling through generations until somebody decides it stops here. Maybe that's why you've heard people say that hurt people hurt people. I believe there's truth in that, but I also believe something else. Healed people, or even people who are trying to heal, have the opportunity to help other people heal. That doesn't mean we're responsible for fixing everyone around us, because none of us have that kind of power. What we do have is the ability to decide what kind of love we're going to put back into the world after everything we've experienced ourselves. When my dad became sick, I had a decision to make. I could continue measuring our relationship by everything that had happened before that moment, or I could decide that whatever time we had left was too valuable to spend keeping score. That did not erase the past, and it certainly didn't erase the memories, but it did allow us to begin writing a different ending. One of the greatest gifts those years gave me was the chance to watch someone become vulnerable enough to receive love without feeling like they had to earn it first. I don't know that my dad would ever have described it that way, but I could feel something changing in him. The walls that had protected him for so many years no longer seemed nearly as important as simply knowing someone would stay beside him through whatever came next. And looking back on it, I honestly think we both were healing at the same time. Not because we talked about every painful memory or solved every unanswered question, but because we finally stopped trying to protect ourselves from each other. There's one realization that continues to stay with me, and I hope you'll think about it after this episode is over. The thing I wanted most from my dad was to feel loved, understood, and accepted. Then one day I realized something that caught me completely off guard. Those were the very things I had never really tried to give him. I had spent years waiting for him to become the person I needed, while never asking whether I'd become the person I wanted to be. That question definitely changed my life. It didn't change it because it filled me with guilt. It changed it because it filled me with freedom. I stopped waiting for someone else to become responsible for the kind of person I wanted to be, and I realized I could choose compassion even when it wasn't easy. I could choose curiosity even when judgment would have been quicker. And then the biggest one, I could choose love without pretending that the hurt had never happened. I think that's why I wanted to share this conversation with you. Not because I think you should make the same choices that I made. Not because I think every relationship can or should be repaired. I just wonder if there's a question underneath the question you've been asking yourself. If you're hurting today because someone you love has hurt your feelings, maybe the answer isn't to rush toward forgiveness or to rush toward walking away. Maybe the first step is simply becoming curious enough to ask yourself why it hurts so deeply, what you're hoping for, what healthy boundaries look like in your situation, and whether there are parts of the story that you haven't been able to see yet. You may arrive at a completely different answer than I did. And that's okay, because this isn't about copying someone else's journey. It's about being honest enough to begin your own. I don't know where this conversation finds you today. Maybe you're thinking about a parent, maybe it's your spouse, one of your children, or maybe it's someone you've already lost and wish you could have had one more conversation with. But wherever your heart is today, I hope you remember something that took me years to understand. Trying to understand someone isn't the same as excusing what hurt you. Sometimes it's simply choosing not to let your pain become the only lens through which you see that other human being. That choice changed my relationship with my dad, and more importantly, it completely changed my relationship with myself. And I want you to know that you changed my life too. I look so forward to our time together, having these little chats. I love that we have this safe space where we can spend time together, hold space for each other, and grow together. So I just want to say thank you. I'm Corey Prophet Boyd, and until next time, don't be afraid to say it anyway.
Say it anyway. With Corey Prophet Boyd. Say it anyway. Say it anyway. With Corey Prophet Boyd. Say it